Now, Karl, the U.S. economy shrank at a pace of 2.9% in Q1. And I've asked a lot of our guests about this because it's a shockingly large number for an expansion. What do you think is going on in the U.S. economy?
Well, I don't believe a lot of the numbers that I see. So there's the seasonal adjustment factors that get put into some of the government reports are utterly comical. So I tend to work off the unadjusted numbers because it's a lot harder to fudge them, although even there you have to wonder whether the data collection's any good. I frankly was not terribly surprised to see that kind of a contraction, but it does mean that the money printing games that have gone on and the credit pumping that has happened within both the U.S. Congress and the Federal Reserve, and let's not get this backwards either. The Fed is the puppet of the government, not the other way around. What this has shown is that these policies have an endpoint where they stop working, and we've reached that. So now, you know, people say, well, the Fed is reducing their bond buying, they're tapering, it's going to go away in October, and they're doing this because the economy is doing better. The truth is they're doing this because the bond laddering systems that are in place in all of the various pension and other funds are reaching a point where the pain exceeds their ability to tolerate it. And so it has to stop. But at the same time, without credit expansion, as we've had over the last 30 years, you're going to see the truth of what our economic activity has really been over that period of time, and it's not positive at all.
So what are you seeing in retail sales, given your view on the economy?
Well, retail sales, again, are driven to a large degree by credit expansion. So what you're seeing now is that as that terminates, as that cycle terminates, the ability to drive retail sales expansion also terminates. And so we are seeing a slowdown in that area. And I think that's going to continue. I don't believe that anyone credible thinks that we can really get 3+% GDP growth rates on a 5-year rolling basis over the next 5 years. And yet most of the economic projections that are being made and the forward views within the stock market and other marketplaces are being based upon this premise. I think this is just absolute nonsense.
So the Fed seems to be more worried about the economy than it lets on. But after all, it's still employing quantitative easing. That's important to remember. And the Fed funds rate is effectively zero right now. So do you think it makes sense for the Fed to ease given the state of the economy?
No, the Fed needs to pull liquidity out of the system. It needs to cut this game out, stop the bond buying, and essentially allow rates to go where they do. The problem you have is that the Fed isn't really the driver of this. You have to remember that the Federal Reserve, by charter, can only buy and sell things that are government guaranteed. That's the charter and that's the law. So if the federal government was to run no deficit, there would be no bonds for the Federal Reserve to buy. When you look at it from the perspective of the top down, the problem with monetary policy is coming from the federal government. It's not coming from the Federal Reserve. We need to stop spending money we don't have. And that's the root cause of the sort of credit expansion cycle that we've seen over the last 30 years. We're now to the point where it's not working anymore to goose apparent economic output. And so you're going to get one of two things. Either the government's going to stop this, in which case we're going to have to pay for all of this expansion that wasn't real, or they're going to keep trying to do it, at which point somewhere we'll go from zero contribution to output to negative contributions, and then you end up in a death spiral where it's forced to end, and the results are catastrophic on the economy.
Now, a recent guest on our show, Frances Coppola, made an interesting observation on Twitter recently, and she wrote, quote, regarding the income inequality debate, it's very simple. Inequality between countries is falling. Inequality within countries is rising. So do you think QE has enhanced inequality here in the U.S.?
Yes, but again, we're looking at the wrong thing. You have to remember that when you run a deficit as a government, what you're doing is depreciating the purchasing power of every unit of currency that you have in circulation. That's factually what's going on. It's an arithmetic thing. It has nothing to do with what you want to call it. So who does that hit first? And the answer is it hits the poor and the middle class because they cannot lever up and use the game playing that you've enabled in order to try to stay ahead of it. The very wealthy, on the other hand, can do those things. Now, of course, with this comes risk. For everybody that manages to beat this game, and become wealthier, on paper at least. There are several who attempt it and find themselves with nothing when the crash comes. We saw that during the housing boom and bust. We saw it during the NASDAQ boom and bust, and we'll see it again this time. There are an awful lot of people who are multimillionaires or even billionaires on paper that in fact have nothing, because all of it is manufactured by leverage. And when the margin calls come, they're going to end up bankrupt. It happened the last time, and it'll happen again.
That was author and blogger Karl Denninger. Time now for today's Big Deal.